The 23rd Congress of the Communist Party convened in Moscow on March 29, 1966, and within 2 weeks the Soviet Union quietly reversed one of Nikita Khrushchev's most symbolic reforms, restoring the old Stalinist title of General Secretary and tightening the apparatus of control that Khrushchev had attempted to loosen. The man who emerged from that Congress with consolidated power was Leonid Brezhnev, a former metallurgist and party functionary whose bland exterior concealed a ruthless instinct for bureaucratic survival. What forces had converged in 1966 to make the Soviet leadership abandon the tentative liberalization of the Khrushchev years and embark on a path that would define the next 2 decades of stagnation? To understand 1966, you must first grasp what had just ended. Khrushchev had been ousted in October of 1964, removed in a bloodless palace coup orchestrated by the very men he had promoted. His crimes, in the eyes of the Politburo, were numerous. The Cuban Missile Crisis humiliation, the agricultural failures despite grandiose Virgin Lands campaigns, the erratic reorganizations of party structure, and most unforgivably the unpredictability itself. The men who replaced him craved stability, control, predictability. They were not ideologues in the fiery sense, they were managers of empire. By 1966, they had spent over a year quietly dismantling Khrushchev's legacy, and the 23rd Congress was the public unveiling of their vision. The Congress itself was a masterclass in Soviet political theater. Over 5,000 delegates packed the Kremlin Palace of Congresses, a modernist structure Khrushchev himself had commissioned, its white marble and glass, a stark contrast to the Gothic spires outside. Brezhnev delivered the Central Committee report over 5 hours across 2 days, a droning recitation of statistics, quotas, and carefully coded signals to the party faithful. He spoke of raising living standards, of scientific progress, of the inevitable triumph of socialism. But beneath the boilerplate language lay a contract. The party would provide modest material improvements in exchange for absolute political obedience. This was the unspoken bargain of what would later be called the era of stagnation. But in 1966 it seemed like wisdom, like relief from chaos. If you're interested in understanding how the machinery of Soviet power actually functioned, not just the propaganda, but the real mechanisms of control and compromise, subscribe now because this channel exists to decode exactly those hidden structures that shaped the Cold War. The restoration of the General Secretary title was more than cosmetic. Khrushchev had renamed the position First Secretary in 1953, symbolically distancing the role from Stalin's dictatorship. By bringing back the old title, Brezhnev's colleagues were making a statement about continuity with pre-Khrushchev traditions, though they were careful to insist this did not mean a return to Stalinism. The distinction was real but subtle. There would be no mass terror, no midnight arrests of Politburo members, no show trials, but there would also be no tolerance for dissent, no experiments with liberalization, no questioning of the party's monopoly. The KGB, reorganized and professionalized under Yuri Andropov, who had taken the chairman's seat in 1967, but was already influential, would handle threats with surgical precision, rather than Stalinist excess. Dissidents would be committed to psychiatric hospitals, exiled internally to remote regions, or expelled from the country rather than executed. This was repression with a technocratic face. What did daily life actually look like in the Soviet Union of 1966 for the ordinary citizen far from the Kremlin's halls? The answer depends entirely on where you stood in the complex hierarchy of Soviet society. For the average urban worker in Moscow or Leningrad, 1966 marked a year of cautious optimism mixed with grinding frustration. The Eighth Five-Year Plan, launched in 1966, promised increased production of consumer goods, a shift from the traditional heavy industry emphasis that had starved Soviet citizens of basic comforts for decades. Wages were rising slowly but perceptibly. A factory worker might earn 120 to 150 rubles a month, and while this was not wealth, it was enough to afford the modest pleasures newly available. A television set, a refrigerator on installment, perhaps a summer vacation at a Black Sea resort through the trade union. But this relative prosperity came with profound limits. The Soviet consumer economy in 1966 was a bizarre parallel universe where the rules of supply and demand had been replaced by central planning quotas and bureaucratic allocation. Goods appeared and disappeared from store shelves according to logic that seemed almost random to shoppers. A woman might spend hours each week standing in multiple queues, one to see what was available, another to pay, a third to collect the item. The famous Soviet joke about a man who hears a neighbor got something and runs to join the queue without even knowing what is being sold captured this reality perfectly. Meat was often scarce. Fresh vegetables outside of summer were nearly impossible to find. Quality was wildly inconsistent because factory managers were rewarded for meeting quantitative targets, not for producing goods that actually worked or lasted. The housing situation in 1966 illustrated both Soviet achievements and Soviet absurdities. Khrushchev's crash program to build cheap prefabricated apartment blocks had put millions of families into their own small flats, ending the nightmare of communal apartments where multiple families shared kitchens and bathrooms. By 1966, these buildings, nicknamed Khrushchevkas, dotted every Soviet city in identical rows of five-story concrete rectangles. They were cramped, poorly insulated, and shoddily constructed, but they represented privacy, a space of one's own, which was revolutionary for people who had lived their entire lives in communal squalor. A typical two-room apartment might house a family of four in about 40 square meters. The ceilings were low, the walls thin enough to hear neighbors' conversations. The elevators absent because 5 stories was the maximum height that did not legally require them. Yet people decorated these tiny spaces with care: bookshelves, rugs, perhaps a piano if space allowed, photographs of relatives, and always the mandatory radio speaker that could be turned down but never fully off. A small reminder of the state's presence, even in private space. The cultural landscape of 1966 reveals the contradictions at the heart of Brezhnev's Soviet Union. This was the year that Andrei Tarkovsky's film Andrei Rublev was completed, though it would not be widely released for years due to official discomfort with its religious themes and medieval violence. It was the year that Mikhail Bulgakov's novel The Master and Margarita, written in the 1930s but suppressed, finally began circulating in samizdat, typed copies passed hand to hand, a literary earthquake that revealed the vitality of underground culture. The official culture promoted by the state was thoroughly sanitized. Patriotic war films, socialist realist novels about heroic workers exceeding quotas, ballet and classical music performances that were world-class but politically safe. Yet beneath this surface, a vibrant unofficial culture thrived in private apartments where poets read to small gatherings, in studios where artists painted abstract works they could never exhibit, in the kitchens where intellectuals debated philosophy and politics until dawn over tea and vodka. The Soviet education system in 1966 was one of the state's genuine achievements, however ideologically constrained. Education was free from kindergarten through university. Literacy was virtually universal among younger generations. Soviet schools produced excellent mathematicians, physicists, and engineers through a rigorous curriculum that emphasized technical subjects and rote learning. A student's path was determined early through examinations and tracking. The brightest might gain admission to prestigious institutions like Moscow State University or the Leningrad Polytechnic Institute, launching careers in research, defense industries, or the space program. But admission was not purely meritocratic. The children of party members and the intelligentsia had advantages. Jews faced quiet quotas limiting their access to top universities despite often stellar academic records. Political reliability mattered as much as talent. Every student, regardless of major, endured mandatory courses in Marxism-Leninism, scientific atheism, and party history, tedious requirements that most endured with practiced cynicism, memorizing the correct answers while privately believing little of it. The Soviet space program in 1966 stood at a crossroads. The early triumphs of Sputnik and Gagarin had given way to a more complex competition with the Americans. The Soviet lunar program was beset by technical problems and bureaucratic infighting. Chief designer Sergei Korolev, the brilliant mind behind the early successes, had died in January 1966 during routine surgery, a loss that would prove catastrophic for Soviet space ambitions, though this was not yet apparent. In 1966, the Soviets achieved the first soft landing on the Moon with Luna 9 in February, transmitting photographs from the surface and proving that the lunar soil could support a spacecraft's weight, a question that had genuinely worried engineers. Luna 10 achieved the first lunar orbit in April. These were real accomplishments, trumpeted in Pravda and on radio broadcasts, sources of national pride that briefly united citizens across the vast country. Yet behind the scenes, the program to put a Soviet cosmonaut on the moon before the Americans was already faltering, hampered by the same systemic problems that plagued the broader Soviet economy. Duplication of effort as competing design bureaus fought for resources, chronic shortages of quality components, and the impossibility of frankly discussing failures or setbacks in a system that punished bearers of bad news. The economy that Brezhnev inherited and sought to manage was entering the phase that would define his era. Slowdown masked by manipulation of statistics. Official growth figures for 1966 showed continued expansion, but the easy gains from post-war reconstruction and Stalin's forced industrialization were exhausted. The economy was extraordinarily inefficient. Central planning meant that factories produced to meet quotas rather than actual demand, leading to warehouses full of goods nobody wanted and shortages of goods everyone needed. Innovation was stifled because factory managers had no incentive to adopt new methods that might disrupt quota fulfillment. The military-industrial complex consumed perhaps 25 to 40% of GDP, a burden that starved the civilian economy, but was considered non-negotiable given the Cold War confrontation. Agriculture remained the system's greatest weakness. Despite employing a quarter of the workforce, Soviet farms could not reliably feed the population. The collective farm system destroyed incentives for efficiency. Peasants lavished care on their tiny private plots, which occupied 3% of agricultural land but produced nearly a third of the country's food, a devastating indictment of collectivization that could never be officially acknowledged. What was it like to be a party member in 1966? The Communist Party of the Soviet Union had about 12 million members, roughly 5% of the population, a selective organization that controlled every lever of power. Membership was essential for career advancement in any significant field. The process of joining involved recommendations from existing members, a probationary period, and investigation of one's background and political reliability. Once admitted, members paid dues, attended meetings, engaged in criticism and self-criticism sessions, and were expected to be models of socialist behavior. In return, they received access to better housing, special stores with goods unavailable to ordinary citizens, vacation resorts, and the possibility of real power. The party was not monolithic. It contained careerists who mouthed ideology while pursuing personal advancement, true believers who genuinely saw themselves as building communism, technocrats who focused on making the system work, and everyone in between. By 1966, cynicism was widespread even among members. The gap between official ideology and observable reality was too wide to ignore. People learned to navigate this gap, to speak one language in public and another in private, to perform loyalty while harboring doubt, a psychological adaptation that became second nature. The KGB in 1966 was an organization transformed from Stalin's era but still formidable. It employed perhaps 500,000 people, including border guards, plus hundreds of thousands of informers. Its role was not merely to catch spies, though counterintelligence remained important, but to monitor society for any sign of deviation. It read mail, tapped phones, planted informers in workplaces and universities, and maintained files on millions of citizens. The paranoia this created was real but operated differently than under Stalin. Most people were not terrified of midnight arrest. Rather, they understood the boundaries of permissible behavior and stayed within them, practicing self-censorship that became automatic. You did not tell political jokes to strangers. You did not criticize party leaders in public. You did not possess forbidden literature unless you deeply trusted your circle. The KGB's success lay in making people police themselves, a far more efficient system than mass terror, and one that preserved the appearance of normalcy. The year 1966 also marked a hardening of Soviet policy toward dissent that would define the Brezhnev era. In September, Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuli Daniel had been tried the previous February of 1966 for publishing works abroad under pseudonyms, works that mocked Soviet life and ideology. Their trial and conviction to labor camp sentences shocked the intelligentsia. This was not a trial of anti-Soviet conspirators or foreign spies, but of writers prosecuted for literature. The trial transcripts, circulated in samizdat, revealed the absurdity of criminalizing imagination. But the message was clear. The brief cultural thaw under Khrushchev was over. In response, a small group of intellectuals began to organize what would become the human rights movement, circulating petitions and open letters demanding respect for Soviet law and constitutional guarantees. These dissidents were few in number, perhaps a few hundred active participants with a few thousand sympathizers, but their emergence in 1966 and the following years represented something new, open, principled opposition that appealed to law rather than to revolutionary change. Life in the Soviet provinces in 1966 differed dramatically from life in Moscow or Leningrad. In industrial cities like Sverdlovsk or Chelyabinsk, factories dominated everything: employment, housing, social life, even food distribution through factory cafeterias. The pollution was often staggering, the air thick with chemical smoke, rivers running colors that water should not be, but this was the price of industrialization and nobody in authority questioned it. In Central Asian republics like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan, Soviet modernity overlaid traditional societies in complex ways. Women who attended university and worked as doctors or teachers might still defer to family patriarchs in matters of marriage. Russian settlers occupied administrative positions while local populations maintained cultural practices that predated Soviet power. In the Baltic republics, incorporated by force in 1940, resentment of Russian rule simmered beneath the surface. Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians maintained distinct identities, languages, and the memory of brief independence between the wars. They were better off materially than most Soviet citizens, but they had not chosen to be Soviet and did not forget this. The Soviet relationship with the outside world in 1966 was defined by the Cold War's rigid bipolarity. Travel abroad was nearly impossible for ordinary citizens. The borders were sealed. Those few who did travel on official delegations or as approved tourists were carefully selected for political reliability and monitored constantly. Western radio broadcasts offered a window to the outside. Voice of America, BBC, Radio Liberty beamed programs in Russian that millions listened to despite jamming efforts. These broadcasts provided news the Soviet media suppressed, and music the state did not approve, though listening was technically illegal and certainly risky. The image of the West presented in Soviet media was contradictory. On one hand, it was depicted as a place of unemployment, racism, and capitalist exploitation where workers suffered. On the other hand, the very existence of Western consumer goods, known through photographs and returning travelers' whispers, created a powerful alternative model. A pair of Western jeans or a rock record became a talisman of a different life, objects invested with meaning far beyond their function. The paradox of everyday life in the Soviet Union of 1966 was that it was simultaneously repressive and secure, stifling and stable. People had no political freedom, no right to criticize the government, no ability to travel, no access to uncensored information. Their material standard of living was far below the West, yet they had guaranteed employment, free healthcare, free education, subsidized housing, and cheap food staples, even if the quality was poor. There was very little violent crime compared to Western cities. Homelessness did not exist in visible form. The social safety net, however modest, was real. Many Soviet citizens accepted this trade-off, especially older generations who remembered the war and the deprivation that preceded it. The stability of 1966 felt like achievement, like progress, even if it meant giving up freedoms they had never possessed. The war in Vietnam cast a long shadow over 1966, and the Soviet Union was deeply involved, though Soviet troops did not fight directly. The USSR provided North Vietnam with weapons, air defense systems, military advisors, and economic aid. Thousands of Soviet anti-aircraft specialists manned SA-2 missile batteries that shot down American planes. This was kept quiet to avoid direct confrontation with the United States, but it was an open secret. For the Soviet leadership, Vietnam served multiple purposes. It bled American resources and attention, it demonstrated Soviet support for national liberation movements, and it provided a proxy battlefield for testing weapons and tactics against the Americans. Soviet citizens followed the war through the lens of official media, which presented it as a heroic struggle of Vietnamese peasants against American imperialism. The narrative was not entirely false, but it omitted the complexity, the North Vietnamese authoritarianism, the Soviet strategic calculations. Still, many Soviet citizens genuinely sympathized with the Vietnamese, seeing in their struggle echoes of the Soviet fight against Nazi Germany, a connection the propaganda skillfully exploited. What did people hope for in 1966? The answer varied enormously. A young engineer might hope for an interesting project, perhaps in the defense sector or space program, work that mattered and challenged the intellect. A mother might hope for her children to gain university admission and better lives than her own. A collective farm worker might hope simply for a decent harvest and enough to eat. A writer navigating the boundaries of censorship might hope to publish something true even if coded in metaphor. A party official might hope for promotion, for an apartment upgrade, for a dacha in the countryside, for the small privileges that marked status. Few hoped for political change because such hopes seemed futile and dangerous. The system felt permanent, as if it had always existed and always would, a perception that both the leadership and ordinary citizens shared, though for different reasons. The year 1966 did not contain a single dramatic event that changed everything. No crisis moment that captured global attention. Its significance lies precisely in its ordinariness, in the way it established patterns that would persist for 2 decades. The contracts made in 1966, the unspoken bargains between rulers and ruled, the bureaucratic sclerosis that set in, the silencing of reform voices, the prioritization of stability over dynamism, all of these defined the Brezhnev era that was just beginning. The Soviet Union of 1966 was a superpower that had achieved parity with the United States in nuclear weapons, that launched sophisticated space missions, that produced world-class scientists and artists. Yet it was also a country where basic consumer goods were scarce, where initiative was punished, where truth was subordinated to ideology, and where the gap between propaganda and reality was a chasm. Everyone saw, but no one could publicly acknowledge. If this exploration of how the Soviet system actually functioned has given you a deeper understanding of Cold War history, this channel is supported by viewers like you, and you can contribute through the Ko-fi link in the description to help us continue researching and producing these documentary investigations into the mechanics of power in the 20th century. The people of 1966 Soviet Union could not know that the system would collapse in 25 years, that the certainties of their world would dissolve, that the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist. From inside 1966, the future seemed predictable, more of the same, gradual improvement in living standards, eternal competition with the West, the slow march toward the communist future that was always promised but never arrived. The tragedy and the irony is that the very stability the Brezhnev leadership chose in 1966, the rejection of reform, the suppression of dynamism, the prioritization of control over adaptation, contained the seeds of the system's eventual failure. They chose certainty over risk, stagnation over experimentation, and in the short term it worked. The Soviet Union of the 1970s would be more prosperous and stable than that of 1966. But systems that cannot reform eventually collapse, and the choice made in 1966 to abandon Khrushchev's chaotic liberalization in favor of bureaucratic conservatism set the Soviet Union on a path that led, inexorably, if not inevitably, to 1991.